Hello and welcome to my November wrap up. I read 13 books this month and I had a lot of fun. It was a little bit up and down in regards to health, and I didn't do all of my greatest ambitions, but I did feel like I got to read a lot of the books that I wanted to read and some books that have been on my TBR for a really long time. And I just had a lot of really good books. I had a few that let me down, but overall this was a very positive experience. So I'm very excited to share some new favorites, some books that I would really recommend, and then, talk about some books that I have some questionable thoughts on. Beginning with the first one, which is Wuthering Heights, which I know so many people love so much, and I don't have the kindest thoughts about it. I do enjoy it, and I understand why it has its place in literature, but at the same time I'm like, why? I don't like people who are just kind of horrible. It's not really my vibe. I really like things that explore really deep trauma and stuff, but also show the hope. And there is elements that there is hope in there. But a lot of it, it's like, I don't understand why these people are so cruel, so just ruthless for no apparent reason. And I find that very exhausting to read. And I think that I wasn't as surprised. I expected, I didn't try to spoil myself about anything, but just the general plot of what is known in public is kind of what happens. So there was also some really hard mental health stuff that was going on, which, as a person who's worked in mental health, I have seen people who've had very hard and self-harmy things done. The fact that people were in several scenes, the main characters violently hurt themselves, and this is not really addressed. I know it's a book from the 1840s, but it's still very hard to watch characters just watch people self-harm and nothing is brought about it. It was very difficult to be like, I've seen this happen and this is terrifying. And this is just happening, and we're like, this is the extent of love, and I'm like, I want to say that in a stigmatizing mental health, because I understand the pain that happens that, and I deal with a lot of mental health, but at the same time just have the characters, and they're almost dismissed, because at one point they're like, this is extent of love, and also the fact that people are like, yeah, they're kind of being over dramatic. Neither of those are good for positive mental health. I don't think that love should make you mad, quote unquote. I think love should make you, make, desire great things, but also rationally talk about those things. And yeah. And also the main characters who are supposedly love also treat each other terribly throughout. There isn't, there's just a lot of aggressiveness and just being like, okay, we're gonna manipulate people. On the other hand, the next book was an immediate favorite. I was just seeped into the world from the first paragraphs, and I really, really loved it. I love the characters. So this is Babel by R.F. Kuang, and she is just such a delicious, deep character writing. It's set in 19th century China and England, and it looks at those dynamics and the world building, the character development, just the way that she can weave stories and put you in a sense of place is so well done. And pretty much the thesis is that we see Robin, who is a young boy at the time, and his mother is dying of plague and of disease and stuff like that. I think it might be cholera. This man comes in, and he's an English guy, and he's like, I'm gonna take you back to England and educate you at Oxford. And he was like, I guess I don't really have much of a choice. I have my dead mother here and this dude that's coming. So he ends up growing up in this very coming of age. I really enjoyed the way that she was able to go from this coming of age, and then they go to Oxford and we have this dark academia stuff, and he's meeting these friends and becoming friends, and then it shifts several other times into genres. All of it has fantasies. So the idea is that in this world, silver is kind of the way that the British Empire has amassed power, and I still don't understand it 100%, but my basic understanding is, I don't know why it's silver, but the idea is that silver is the conduit. So if you translate something from Latin to Mandarin, and it has the same meaning but slightly different, that's where the power comes from. So transmutation, transfiguration, and the way that those transfer, and the slightly different meaning but same origin, I think. But pretty much the way that this manifests is the fact that these characters have to be fluent in both languages. You can't just say words you don't know. So they're taking people from oppressed and colonized countries and using them to translate words in order to get the power to colonize and enslave other countries. And that is brutal, and also a really great metaphor for the British Empire and the ways in which a lot of colonial countries have taken control of other people and abused people with the power and labor of their own things, or the food and the industry, the ways that the spice trade and so much of the other stuff has contributed to we're going to take these powers. And in the background of this, the Opium War is happening. So this is a war in which pretty much England came and offered free opium to Chinese sailors and to Chinese other people, and then got them addicted, and then made them break down their walls of trade in order to sell them opium. And through a lot of this, these people are saying like free trade, we just want free trade, like the Chinese government isn't allowing us to trade. And several of the people are like, yeah, but in England, you're not allowed to have opium because you know that it's not great. And it's like, but your people want them. And it's like, yeah, you're taking vulnerable people and addicting them and then trying to use that to amass power in a country. And this is a real war that happened. And I really like the fact that it highlights it and it discusses it. And throughout, we really have a lot of like intellectual conversations on colonialism and the way that like translation and the ways that things are amassed and stuff, and about academia. Like Rebecca Kwan talks about how like this is kind of her letter to Oxford. She went to Oxford herself, and the ways in which she, as a minority student, was treated in a very, very white upper class, English, or I think she went to school in America as well, like just higher education and the way that they treat people as things. Because the thing that is said throughout is like, you should be grateful, you should be honored. Like, and every time they try to be like, hey, like why don't you teach Chinese scholars to like translate things into Chinese or something that's Cantonese to Arabic? Like, wouldn't that be smart? And they're like, no, 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 no. You have to do it into English because that's where the power is. And all of these things. And like every time they're like, hey, I don't know if this is correct. They're like, well, you're definitely being ungrateful for the education that you received and the sponsorship and free, all of these things that you received. And I think that that's still a thing that minorities get all the time. Like, shouldn't you be grateful that you got like the bare minimum? Shouldn't you be grateful that we're treating you like a human? So it's such a great fantasy book with really great characters and dynamics and world building, but also like really explores social issues in the way that we see culture and stuff. And I think that it's a brilliantly read book. Like, I haven't read The Poppy War because I know it's very dark, and yet I'm like, okay, I'm gonna read that now. The next book was my first book in actual nonfiction November, and I really, really enjoyed the conversation and the dialogue in this. This is Out of the Sun, Storytelling and Race, and this is by Essie Adesian, and she is a very well-known Canadian author who has won, I think, our prize, the Giller, twice, and I think she's also been recommended and like on the Booker list and some other things. So she's fairly well known, and I haven't read her books yet. They're books that like, and you're like, I want to read that book, but you're kind of intimidated because it's like such a well-known author. That's how I feel about her. So reading this, I'm like, okay, I can't wait, because she writes about nonfiction so interestingly and so weaved, and like the way that she's able to like explain things and talk about things in like very simple but evocative language, I thought was really well. And the first thing that she kind of looks at is portraiture of the 18th and 19th centuries and the way that it depicted Black characters. And then we also talk about Dido Elizabeth Bell and her portraiture. She's the first person of African ancestry at all to be seen level with a white person, and yet she also talks about the ways in which, she's like flowers in her hair and is like seen in motion, when her cousin is like kind of stock and looking at the camera in like pinks and very like more genteel, less wild things. So I found that very interesting to look at that. And then she kind of goes through in points like I thought that some of the things didn't connect well, because it's a series of lectures in Canada that she wrote these for, and it was written in 2021. So it's very interesting the ways in which like she has an entire like one talking about Rachel Dolezal and like passing, and the way in which people have transracialed and stuff like that, especially from white into Black, and using that as social clout and using that as things. And where is the line between being involved in civil rights and promotion and stuff like that and crossing over and being exploitative and being appropriative. And it's a more compassionate lens than I would have ever assumed on Rachel Dolezal, but it's interesting to read her point of view, and she does it very well. And she kind of looks at a variety of things. One of the ones I really love is ghosts and ghost stories and the ways that we tell ghosts. So she talks about like murders in Canada and the ways in which like Indigenous and Black people have been killed and like their murders have not been spoken about. And she talks about how the ghosts we see are the ghosts we choose to see. So the idea that like so often she's telling like the stories about like people worrying about hauntings and stuff like that, and not ever thinking about like the hundreds and thousands of Indigenous people that have been like murdered on Canadian land and stuff, and how they're like, maybe it's like the Scandinavian group and stuff. And I really enjoy the ways that she tells the story. Some of the essays are more my liking than others, but I thought that they all really shared a lot too about the history of race and storytelling and the way that it goes. And I really love like more educational things. Like, I find them very interesting, and I liked the fact that even though it is very approachable, it is definitely written for like an academic lens. And it's like, okay, how are we going to look into the things? Like, she's not really trying to tell you a narrative about storytelling. She's not trying to be like, this is my point about how storytelling has done this or how race has done this. She's just like, let's examine one aspect of storytelling and one aspect of race or things like that, and let's talk about it for a bit. And I'm like, that's cool. I like learning. It's The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, and this has two letters, one originally written on the 100th anniversary of emancipation to his nephew, who is also named James, and then he also has one that's called To the Religion in My Mind. And I think I'm going to end up quoting a little bit from a review because I think that James Baldwin writes much more powerfully than I do. Like, I started the audiobook and then I immediately stopped it and I was like, I have not like gotten through a minute of any of his audiobooks and not stopped to write down his word because his wording is so good, it's so evocative. And it begins, "For the heart of the matter is here and the root of my dispute with my country. You were born," and here he's talking to his nephew, "where you were born, and face the future you face because you were black. And for no reason, the limits of your ambition were thus expected to set forever. You were born into a society that spelled out with brutal clarity and in as many ways as possible that you were a useless human being. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity. Wherever you have turned, James, in your short time on earth, you've been told where to go and what you could do and how you could do it, where you can live and who you can marry." A lot of it is him talking about white complicity and the ways in which like white people are like, we don't need to talk about this. And I know that I'm guilty of that too. Not actually talking and not actually being educated about the things that need to be done, being like, well, it's not the same. And it's like, no, you're like not acknowledging the things that have both been affected directly in here. Like this is one that I also really like because he's talking to his brother and he's talking to his nephew, and here he says, "I've known you both all your lives. I don't know if you've known anyone for that far back. If you've loved anyone that long, first as an infant, then as a child, then as a man, you gain a strange perspective on time and human pain and effort. Other people cannot see what I see whenever I look into your father's face. For behind your father's face today are all those other faces which were his." And then he talks about like remembering the look on his face in a house that he no longer even remembers because he's so young. And as someone who has nephews, as someone who has family, like I love just the ways in which he talks about like people and writing and stuff. Talking about like white complicity and the ways in which white people just choose to ignore things is something that he talks about right here, and I really love this quote, which says, "But it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence that constitutes the crime." And then he says below, "These innocent, well-meaning people, your countrymen, have caused you to be born into conditions," and then he compares it to Oliver Twist in the way like that Oliver Twist is relatable. And he's like, yes, I'm going to use like this 18th century canon guy that they're all going to know. Because, if you actually use real black suffering, then. And then he says, "I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain." And I think all of it is just really, really well done and written in a way that's like, yeah, okay, I'm writing to a black audience. I'm writing to like the ways in which that, like he talks about how, we are celebrating 100 years of freedom 100 years too soon. He's like, these are still things, like they're still in the midst of the civil rights era. And he's like, and we're talking about 100 years of freedom. And I just really find him a very powerful writer. I find him a very evocative writer, and the ways that he's able to succinctly say things. So 2 or 3 weeks after the Giller was actually announced, I decided that this was the time when I was going to read my first Giller book, and I read The Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century by Kim Fu, and I really, really liked this. There was like some short stories that I loved better than most, but like some of the ones that you have ups and downs, but these ones were really like, some of them were like mythical, some of them were coming of age, some of them were very like technological, and I find them very interesting. Like she writes very intriguing. Like I like listening to her. Like she talks about like, this story time when like you're looking at adolescents and they're kind of all drifting away. This neighborhood family dies of monoxide poisoning and all of the kids are like, let's take a doll, and they all take apart and they're all having like nightmares and stuff. And they all have these experiences that they continue on, and they go to high school and none of them are friends, but they all still have this like haunting experience of like adolescence. And there's another one where like there's a machine where someone can kill each other and immediately reprint. So him and his wife keep on killing each other and having these experiences. And it's like, okay, like it's really like about 21st century one. Another one is The Opening, and it's kind of devastating. It's probably my favorite. Like it's a very good starting point. And it's about this woman who wants to see her mother. And they're like, well, you can't see your mother because it's artificial technology. I'm starting to get a little teared up. That's how I feel about this. But pretty much she's like, I really just want this experience with my mother. Like I want to be able to have one moment, as I'm learning to grieve her and stuff. And they're like, well, that's not in the guidelines. And then it takes an interesting turn and stuff. And I really love the exploration. And it's like, it's very character focused. It's very theme focused. And it's interesting. Like I really would love to read more of her books, or especially her short stories, because I feel like these work very, very well. They show the reason why some of these off these hands things can work better as short stories than full novellas or novels. So this month I'm supposed to be doing a buddy read with Monica from Dog-Eared Pages. It was going great, but in the middle of my buddy read, which I was like already a chapter behind, she was talking about Ethan Frome in comparison to Rebecca, one of my favorite novels of all time, and I was like, you know, I'm gonna stop this and read this. So I read Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton, and I previously read Age of Innocence, which I definitely liked. Like, it's one of those books that like you don't absolutely love, but you like have very, very fond memories about it. That's how I feel. Like, I feel like I want to reread it and like analyze it because it was such an interesting book, even though it's not like one of those books that like sits close to your heart. So this is a book that I feel doesn't sit close to my heart, but I still have a lot of thoughts about it. It's like a solid 3-star. Like, it's one of those books that's like interesting. And it's one of her only rural stories. It's set in 1911, and it's actually based on real events, which I won't talk about because it spoils the end of the book. But this is a short novella, and it begins with an unnamed narrator. One of the things that he's told very early is that Ethan Frome has spent too many winters in Starkfield, is the name of the place. And that's like an interesting, haunting, like grab your flesh kind of way, like what is happening here? And slowly after that, we end halfway where he gets stuck in a snowstorm and he is going to meet Ethan Frome at his house. And we begin as he's walking into the thing. And then we get the whole story. And at the end, he finally does walk into the room and we have the reveal. So that's very interesting because what you would imagine would be revealed at the beginning of the novel, like in the like kind of prelude prologue, and what is actually revealed in the epilogue is very different. And I find it very intriguing. I feel like I also can't talk about a lot of the book without spoiling it. Like, there's not probably a lot of like wide variety of what is known there. And I have a lot of thoughts about especially the ways that it deals with disability and that representation. As a disabled woman myself, I often struggle with the ways that books are represented, and this deals with disability and women and like especially people on whether they're faking their illness, whether they're being hypochondriac, whether that's like entrapment. There's definitely ways that I don't like, and I think that I took some lesser appreciation from this book because it's not necessarily saying anything terrible about disability or chronic illness, but it's also definitely not saying positive things. So as people who know about disability, are disabled, and have read this book, I would love to have your thoughts because I definitely have some thoughts of my own. But overall, it's a story where Ethan Frome is being very intrigued by a young cousin of his wife's who's staying at their house. And him and his wife have an interesting relationship and history. So that's what I will leave it at. I don't think it's like an extraordinary book, but I also don't think it's a bad book. And it's a book that like, I'm like, yeah, it wasn't, it was short and I was still like ready for it to be over. But I think that it does things, and also some of the things it does is incredibly problematic. But we jump from problematic to like a great book that I really, really loved, and this was Heartstopper Yearbook. I love the Heartstopper graphic novels, they're really lovely, and this is kind of like, it's kind of in universe, but it's also kind of about it, and it really looks at Alice Oseman and their story of like creating it, I think starting in 2013 and then starting to do it more in 2014 and 2015. And I actually also like this week listened to a detailed diatribe of OSP's 10th year anniversary, which I love. Overly Sarcastic Productions has been one of the oldest YouTube channels I've ever watched. It is two people and they talk about history and myths and the ways in which stories does it and classic literature, and they each kind of take one section and they talk about it, and they're also both ace and really cool, and I really love them. So I also just like love male-female friendships that are completely platonic. Like, I feel like that's the greatest thing in partnerships over 10 years. So yeah, they're super cool, and I have always loved their channel. I also found out through this video that I started seeing them before they like had their major push into like the big leagues, as they say. But both of them kind of deal with the fact that like, you know, you don't have to be successful right away. Like, when you sometimes feel like things are like not going well, or you're just trying the same thing over and over again, and it's like it's not super paying off, but you're having fun and you're learning things, like how valuable that is. And I found that really encouraging. November was a month where I'm like, it's NaNoWriMo, I want to do some things. Like, I'm not gonna read 50,000 words, but like I want to do some stuff. And it was not a month that ended up being particularly productive. And I think that encouragement of being like, sometimes things take a very long time to get successful. Sometimes they take a very long time to get right, or like the things that like you continue to improve on. I also had a great conversation with my friend Ruth, who is an author I interviewed on the channel, and she also has always encouraged me that like you don't need to be perfect to do things, and I really, really struggle with that. I really want perfection. I really want to be like really well done. And Blue and Red kind of talk about this in Overly Sarcastic Productions like 10-year diagram as well. They're talking about the fact that like, you know, sometimes you only need to do something 80%, and that allows you, like, you could think about that last 20% until it kills you. But it's better to do like 4 things to 80% than to do like everything to 100. And that is a lesson I still need to learn. And I think Alice Oseman really takes that, like looking at her journey and being like, okay, this is what I wrote. And like, I learned so much about art in like 2015. I started this in 2013 and I published in 2018. And like, that's the journey. And like looking at that, I think that's really encouraging as a young creative, as a person who loves like learning and, you know, who's had a YouTube channel for 5 years that is still, you know, very small. And like those things of being like, okay, I'm like putting a lot of effort into this. I'm trying, and like I'm not always satisfied with my output. I'm not always satisfied with my content or like what I'm doing, and being like, it's okay. Like I don't need to be perfect in everything that I do, whether that's writing or creating or any of those things. So I loved it. I found it very encouraging, and it also has some like nice things where it's like yearbooky, where we have, you know, this is a history, or this is their story, or this is why I created this character, or this is like fun facts about them. N.D. Stevenson also did this with The Fire Never Goes Out, which is such an incredible memoir where it looks through their journey of like experiencing early writing, and how they went through college and did writing, and, you know, came out, and like the ways in which they changed and developed as an artist and a creative, and how they wanted to do so much and then ended up burning out. Like I really enjoy like people reflecting on creative things, because I think that only ever helps people. It only ever aids people to actually have these journeys in which you can see that like being successful or being creative or being like satisfied does not always look the same, and it often takes a really, really long time. And I think all of them talk about like once you get there, you also have a lot less time. Like you're busy a lot of the time spending time, and it takes a lot of work to do things. So I really, really enjoyed that. I'm going to link my next two books together. The first one is I'm Not a Number by Jenny K. Dupez. The next book I'm going to be talking about is When We Are Alone by David A. Robertson. The reason I'm going to be talking about them is that they're both picture books talking about residential schools and the ways in which the abuses and stuff like that have been perpetuated. And I really, really liked I'm Not a Number. It's set in Ontario, very, very close to me. And I appreciated the fact that I was very aware of the culture and stuff, which I know is not obviously necessary because I live on Anishinaabe land and have Anishinaabe friends. Like I understand Ojibwe enough, like not well. Like I'm not saying I know well, but like I know it as much as some people know French or Spanish, you know what I mean? Like I'm familiar enough with it, so I was actually able to, like, when reading the book and they would speak in Ojibwe, I was like, I recognize that word. Like I know hello and thank you and grandmother and like those like words, you know what I mean, that you kind of know from other languages without like actually knowing the language. And I found that like very, very aware that it happened here. The story is told from the granddaughter of the woman who went through this. And it talks about the Spanish Indian residential school and how they spoke to them as numbers and stuff like that, and how they completely depersonalized them. They said, you're just a number and you're not allowed to do those things. One of the basic things that happened in a lot of residential schools was like the cutting and removing of hair and stuff like that, and making it sheen. And one of the things that Irene, the main character, talks about is how it's a death. That's something that's very common in Anishinaabe culture. I'm not sure about its universality in Indigenous people of like North America, but I know it's very common is that you shave your head whenever you go through a death. And she talks about how like they don't know that that's true, and yet with every bit of hair, with every like lock of hair falling off, it's death. Like you're taking who I am, the people I come from, all of these things, and removing it physically from my body. And yet you're also somewhat like using the metaphor my people already use for death. Removing language and culture and hair and the ways that you're allowed to present yourself, the way you're allowed to speak, the way you're allowed to interact from it is already terrible. And I think both of these books deal so much with that, and how you can explain that to children and how you can talk about that. Like neither of these books talk directly as much about the physical and sexual abuse that happened in these things. Like obviously those are very, very important things to talk about, but harder to talk about with like, you know, 3 to 5 year olds, which is kind of the aiming probably of this book. But talking about the ways in which culture is ripped from it. And it also does look at physical abuse as well, and like the ways that like they were made to eat terrible food, and then like made to eat their vomit if they threw up with that food. Like things that were just grotesque and dehumanizing and all of those things. And When We Are Alone is less story-based and more like narrative, because it is about this young girl who's looking at her grandmother who's using all these things, and she's like, why do you wear bright clothes? And she's like, well, when we went to residential schools, they would take us and they didn't like us to be colorful, so they took our clothes away, and now I dress at things. And like the story is like, when we were alone, we would put leaves on ourselves to celebrate the fact that we were colorful. It talks about like her being separated from her brother, and she's like, yeah, so when I was alone, I held my brother's hand because that was the only time I was allowed to be connected, and now I value those relationships. And I like the reclaiming of it. I like how I'm Not a Number tells a story, and I like how When We Were Alone reclaims that story of being like, these are the things that were taken from me, and now these are the things that I know to value. And obviously those things should never have been taken away, but I like the reclaiming of being like, here's how we can tell this story of trauma and abuse and genocide to a younger generation, and then also reclaim it as like a place where we are not defined by this. We will also choose to reestablish our traits and stuff like that, which is things that, you know, a lot of people lost because obviously there was genocide, and you spend your entire adolescence and childhood not being around your family, not being able to call your name, not to be in your traditions, not to speak your language, not to have communication with family. Like, how are you supposed to parent? And like, how are you supposed to parent? How are you supposed to pass on those traits and family system if you weren't even allowed to be a family when you were growing up? And this ended up a bigger rant than the book itself, but I think that both of these books do a very, very good job of talking about residential schools and talking about Indigenous identity as a whole, and I really am happy that these books exist for children as well. It seems like a very strange transition because I'm going from residential schools to talking about a Catholic priest who actually I really appreciated In the Name of Jesus, which is a different book that I'm currently reading by him. Written in 1989, he's like, and the atrocities that we committed against Indigenous people in schools. And I was like, thank you for acknowledging this 30 years ago. But yeah, not perfect, and the organizations he was involved in were definitely not perfect. But the man himself actually was a very interesting gay Catholic priest who talked about lots of things. So really interested in his work and stuff. And I really like this book. It is called Spiritual Direction, and it is beat up and coffee stained because I carried it around for like 3 years reading it and have reread it over and over again. But I really just enjoy it because it's looking at like spiritual direction and the idea of like the first thing is like acknowledging our worth and like seeing the value that we have from God and stuff, and how do we allow and show that with other people, and then like how do we share that. Like I really enjoyed the fact like it talks a lot about community and having solitude and embracing yourself and being vulnerable and accepting, you know, like you can't always do it all. And this is just one of the things he wrote, is wherever you go I go with you, and wherever you rest I keep watch. And I really love like the idea like my soul is restless until it rests in you, oh God. Like just like taking time to be like, okay, I'm going to be contemplative, I'm going to be restful. Like, you know, Christianity is sometimes seen as like this ascent into like works and like, you know, being really harsh or judgmental or all of those things toward people. And I'm like, you know, rest, be kind to people, like be loving, try to make the world a better place. Like those are the things that I value in Christianity. And it's late at night, so I'm kind of preaching or whatever, but I do sometimes feel strange talking about anything faith related on my channel or something like that, because I feel like a lot of people obviously have a lot of trauma about it, and like I feel like that's completely fair. And I'm not like trying to be preachy, I'm just trying to be like, these are things that matter to me. I really love this section at the end. Like I spent a lot of time thinking about it, but like it's talking about voluntary displacement and the idea that as Christians, in this view that like it's not about being better, like it's about choosing to allow things to happen. So like the idea that says voluntary displacement unmasks the illusion that we have to make it to the top and offers us a glimpse of a deeper spirituality. It puts us in touch with our own suffering and pain, our own woundedness and brokenness, our own limitations and powerlessness. And then he says here, the remarkable paradox of displacement and downward mobility is it creates community. So like the guy is really into being like, okay, we're gonna accept our vulnerability, we're gonna accept our limitedness, and we're not gonna be ashamed of those things. We're actually gonna spend time valuing them and valuing each other and laying part of our pride so that we can value other people. So then we're gonna move on to Daena, the Unseen Ones. And this one deals with a collection of short stories, the last one specifically dealing with unseen ones, as in the women that are murdered and missing and the ones that have been abused as Indigenous women, and just the atrocities that have been committed. And it says, just another Inuit woman lost in a community statistic. And it has more of like that vibe where like it has the, I don't know if flippant the right word, but like the ways that it takes on almost the negative perspective and like views of it and stuff. And it's a very, very hard book to read. I enjoyed the dialogue and the conversations and the ways that these characters are receiving representation and stuff like that. And some of them are quite funny. Like there's one about like these like older women who are all trying to like get with this man who's like, I don't know, he's been divorced like 8 times. They're like, you know, we want to be his summer companion. Because, you know, he needs like a nice woman who's like at least 60 because he's like 75. And they're like, yeah, you can't like date a younger woman. That's just, you know, whatever. So you have to find a well-dressed 60-year-old. And in that, it also deals with racism because they're like, you know, then the Indigenous woman starts like getting more of his attention, and they're like, you're here for only representations that we're not all white, so like you can't do this. But then there's another one like where a priest in the Inuit community like gets whisked away by a ghost, and he's like, here, you're going to discover the Inuit gods and stuff and the afterlife and stuff. So some of those are really interesting, but a lot of them deal with a lot of domestic and sexual abuse, like repetitively, and the ways in which a woman is assaulted and the way that she deals with like the stress and the anxiety. I also appreciated that she's an older woman. I think it happens in her 50s. And Norma Dunning is an older woman, I believe, probably like 60s or 70s. So I like the fact that a lot of these characters are older characters and is looking at the abuse and the way that you try to come back from there, the way that you try to learn. And yeah, it's a very well written book, but it is not for the light of heart. Like it's quite graphic in many, many scenes. And then for the end of the month, I moved back to fantasy, and I had a lot of fantasy this month. I have over the last few years distanced myself from fantasy, not purposely. I found as the pandemic hit and stuff like that, I've had a harder time with fantasy. But Chloe Gunn just knocks it out of the thing every time. Like, I read 3 of her books now, and they have all been 5 stars, which I don't think has happened. Like, I am still very hesitant with my 5 stars. And this one is kind of set on As You Like It. I actually have to look at the things because it's a play I think I read, and then I read the manga, but I don't remember it a lot. But pretty much this is set in 1931. I think 5 years, somewhere like that, after the end of the big things in the first series. This is connected. It deals with Juliet's cousins, who are minor to somewhat major characters in the first series. Kathleen/Cecilia is a more important character in the original series, and she is kind of the third dairy character, but her point of views are actually, I feel like, less than they are in the first one. She's the cousin of Juliet, the sister of Rosalind, and she is a woman who was assigned male at birth and has that story as part of her background and stuff like that. But I feel like there isn't a ton of plot overthing, because a lot of her story is her identity and stuff like that in her first book, which is relevant to her story, but it's not like plot buildings that you're building on. And then Rosalind is a character who definitely appears, like, you know, Juliet as Rosalind in there. So I really like her as a character, and I found her great. She's demisexual, which is just so great. I love that representation. And then what's his name? Orion. And then Orion is our secondary character. And they are both spies, and they end up being set into an espionage marriage, which I love. I had no idea that that was a trope in it. I was like, Chloe Gunn, yay. And I actually thought it was following one of the other characters, which is a kind of not, she's not really a main character. I would say, like, she's like a supporting character, because I don't think she really has a point of view, but she's like involved in a lot of things. So I thought she was actually the main character of the series, and then I was like, oh, Rosalind, I love her. And I don't think that's spoiling, because I don't think either of them were supposed to die in the first series, which a fair amount of characters die in the first series, because Romeo and Juliet. But yeah, I really like her writing. I feel like it feels so alive immediately, like that in 1930s Shanghai, and deals with all the social dynamics and the ways in which the 20th century is changing. In the background, we have Manchuria being invaded by the Japanese. We have the communism and nationalist parties and the ways that they are kind of fighting against each other. And she talks about in the end that, like, obviously things are not completely real, because, you know, there's some fantasy aspects, although the fantasy is not like the most major aspects. Like, it's definitely lighter fantasy. It's not like people are doing like spells out of corners and stuff. It's just like there's some magical antagonism and other stuff going on and stuff like that, but it's not like a major aspect. But I really just enjoy the characters so much. Like, can you tell by the smiles that when I can't talk about how many things I love? And then I really wanted to read Curse by Marissa Meyer, but I was like, I can't read 2 of my most anticipated books right next to each other. So I read Curses instead by Lish McBride, which is a book that I started in May, and I actually restarted it from the beginning. And I read it. It was okay. It is a gender-swapped retelling of Beauty and the Beast. So the Beast is a woman, and then the Beauty is a boy, and he has like the ability to glamour people, and he's just very remarkably pretty as well. And yeah, it's one of those stories where, like, he's gonna help her fall in love with people, and he's not gonna fall in love with her. It's fine. I feel like at times, like, it was definitely supposed to be funny. Like, it's very lighthearted. I just read this shortly after reading Persuasion 2022, and I was like, ah, yes. Like, it's saying things that are like contemporary and stuff like that that don't really belong. I liked the full cast of characters. I liked that it was diverse and had representation, and it was like a fun romp in the like things that it's like, it's mythological. It's not like very accurate to old-timey things, but one of the things that I really liked is there's archetypes in it, because we have her suitors and stuff who would have an advantageous married with a beast and all of those things, and yet it plays with some of them, like the idea that, like, the person's just malicious or evil. Like, we get points of views from like kind of one of the most prominent villains, and I find that very intriguing. It also deals with her like mother-daughter relationship, because her mother curses her, and they're like, well, they're not just understanding, but I think a lot of it's like we have those relationships, we have those dynamics, and we don't sit in them. And I really like to sit in characters. I like to, like, if it's not like nasal brain, you know, like if you're not in the nasal, if you're not in the brain, if you're not like thinking all of the time, like, what's the point? Because sometimes I was like, these relationships don't feel like they're fully fleshed out. They don't feel like they're fully justified based on what we've seen. But it also felt like it ran long. Like, there was a times where I was like, okay, get along, and yet, like, I also wanted more. So it's one of those things where it's like, it's a good 3-star. If you want a fun romp that's like diverse and great and interesting dynamics, sure, read it. I finished the first day of December, so I'll just mention it, which is Fevered Star by Rebecca Roanhars. I had read part of it and then finished it, and I really wanted to read this. Like, I loved Black Sun. It was like a 5-star, one of my favorite books of 2021, and I was disappointed in this. It was the most like second book syndrome I have ever seen. Like, it just nothing happened. Like, part of it is like it felt like, you know, the first quarter when you're kind of getting back into a book, and it's kind of like the characters are displaced, they're thinking about what they're doing, they're thinking about these things, they're like, okay, we had this defeat, we had this, we need to think about it. And then that was a book for like 400 pages. And at the end, they're like, let's make a decision to go forward. And then the book ends. Like, the book literally ended. I was like, what? We didn't have a battle. We didn't have a confrontation. We didn't have anything. And I love just sitting and character development. But I didn't find these characters, like, they did think, but they didn't think about things that I was interested in. I think one of the major things is, like, one of the characters is very confused about, like, destiny versus free will and stuff like that. And, like, a big thing is, like, what is destiny and what is free will, and am I a person, or should I just follow this cult? And you're like, the character is probably going to end up choosing free will and choosing not to be the part of this cult and choosing to, like, make their own path, because that's the journey every character is going to make. So, like, listening to them talk about it was like, okay, I don't need to, like, have like 100 pages or, you know, 150 pages of you thinking about, like, whether you're going to do the thing that you're probably going to do. And, like, I think that there's interesting because there's other book series like David Bad Trilogy that a lot of people complain like book 2 is boring. And I'm like, no, book 2 is interesting because it really develops the characters and stuff like that. It spends a lot of time in relationship building, and these characters did not see each other. Like, I don't want to spoil things that happen, but, like, there wasn't a lot that happened. Like, mostly, like, the characters that were the most entwined in book 1 do not spend a single sentence seeing each other at all. And it's like, okay, now we have a bunch of new characters that I don't care about. And I like large ensembles. I really struggled with this one. But those were my thoughts. I wish I had loved it more. And I really hope book 3, like, redeems it. And I look back at book 2 and I was like, oh, I was wrong. We needed all of this to set up book 3. The last book I'll talk about in detail is Sonnets of the Portuguese by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I read about 20 of the 49, I believe, sonnets, and I found them really interesting. She talks about grief and depression and the ways in which you love someone and you think you're not good enough for them so well. I really, really enjoyed her explanation. And, like, you're reading it, you're like, this sounds contemporary. Like, you would say this and it relates to it so deeply. And I spent so much time like rereading them and enjoying them and being like, yes, I love this. And then I will quickly mention that I read some of Interpreter of Melody. I really like this short story collection. I think that Jen Lahiri is such a great writer. Like, I want to diagram everything she writes because she sets tone, characters, themes so well, so shortly, so succinctly. And I can't read her books because of that, because I get distracted so easily. Like, I want to read, I want to write, I want to diagram. Like, when I'm reading her, I'm like, oh my goodness, I love her so much that I don't read her. I really did enjoy almost every book that I read this month. Like, the books that I didn't enjoy, I was like, this was still fun. Some of them I'm like, they could have ended sooner. But, you know, that is books. So let me know which book you loved in November, which book you didn't love in November, which book you think I should have loved or should read in the future, or, you know, any of the questions you would love to comment, because I love comments. Like, one of my favorite things is just reading comments because they make me happy. It's like, people have thoughts about the things I said. If you don't have time to comment today, you can always put a horse or a sleigh. If you're a deep cut person into one of these books, you'll understand exactly. Or, like, a thing of poison. What other things are represented in this? A beast, a curse, some love for Heartstoppers. I hope that you had a great time listening to this and reading this, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.